The dresses were laid out before the names were read. 14 identical gowns of coarse black cotton, starched to a crackling severity, arranged in a neat row across the long pine table in the servants' hall at Harrowden. One the same. High collar, narrow cuff, not a stitch of ornament. They were not dresses. They were uniforms of erasure, designed to make whoever wore them utterly forgettable. The temporary girls, hired from the village and the surrounding farms for the Duke's midsummer ball, stood along the opposite wall in a restless, whispering line. They had been at Harrowden Hall for 3 weeks already, scrubbing floors, polishing silver, and preparing the great house for the grandest social occasion in the county. The night itself was only 2 days away, and the final assignments were about to be given. Mrs. Crail entered through the far door. She did not need to call for silence. Her presence commanded it, the way a sudden frost commands a garden. She was a tall woman, angular and sharp, with iron-colored hair pulled so tightly from her face it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples. She had served as head housekeeper at Harrowden for 18 years, first under the old Duke and now under his son, and she carried that tenure like an armored breastplate. She held a single sheet of paper. "You will listen once," she said. Her voice was flat and exact, the voice of a woman who considered repetition a personal failing. "I will not repeat myself." She read the assignments without looking up, names and positions, delivered in clipped pairs. Bridget and Lottie to the main hall, carrying trays of champagne. Ruth and Hannah to the dining room, managing the supper service. Clara and Peg to the cloakroom, receiving the guests' wraps and coats. On it went, each girl slotted into the elaborate machinery of the evening with the efficiency of a watchmaker placing gears. Nell stood at the end of the line. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her apron, her face composed into the expression of patient stillness she had perfected over 3 weeks of service. She waited for her name. It came last. Nell. Below stairs. Scullery detail. You will wash the crystal, polish the plate, and clear the refuse from the kitchen. You will not enter any room above the service corridor. You will not be seen by any guest under any circumstance. Is that clear? Yes, Mrs. Crail. The words left her mouth before the sting of them could fully register. Below stairs, the lowest assignment, the most invisible post in the entire household. Every other temporary girl would at least glimpse the ballroom, the candles, the music, the slow turning splendor of silk gowns. Nell would see the underside of the evening, the steam and the grease and the endless parade of soiled glassware. She felt the eyes of the other girls on her. Some carried a thin film of pity. Most held a careful, sharp-edged satisfaction. 3 weeks was long enough to learn the gradations of cruelty in a servants' hall, and Nell had learned them well. Pity was always worse than malice. Pity meant they believed she belonged exactly where she had been placed. Mrs. Brie. Crail folded the paper and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She was not finished. "One further matter," she said, and her gaze, which had been sweeping the room with the flat precision of a scythe, came to rest squarely on Nell. It settled there and did not move. The mare in the east paddock is not a curiosity. She is not a plaything. She is the property of His Grace, and she is dangerous. No member of this staff, whether temporary or permanent, is to approach her, speak to her, or set foot inside that paddock for any reason. The head groom alone tends the animal. Anyone found in violation will be dismissed on the spot, without reference and without the remainder of their wages. She did not say Nell's name again. She did not need to. Every person in that room understood exactly who the rule was written for. It was not for Bridget, who blanched at the sight of any horse bigger than a cart pony. It was not for Ruth or Hannah, who had never so much as glanced toward the east paddock. It was for Nell, the quiet one, the strange one, the girl who had somehow drawn the devotion of the creature that haunted the eastern edge of the estate like a pale and restless ghost. The mare's name was Reverie. She was an Arabian, the color of winter clouds, with a mane like blown silk and enormous dark eyes that held a grief no amount of gentle handling could reach. She had belonged to Lady Rosabelle, the Duke's younger sister, and before the accident, the mare had been the most admired horse in the county. Spirited but willing, powerful but kind, she had carried Rosabelle across these northern moors as though the two of them shared a single heartbeat. That was before. 9 months ago, on a raw November morning, Lady Rosabelle had taken Reverie out across the high fells. The ground was wet. A rabbit bolted from a hedgerow. The mare spooked and stumbled. Rosabelle was thrown. She struck a boundary stone with the back of her head and never opened her eyes again. The horse had stood over her body for 2 hours before the search party found them, her silver muzzle pressed to Rosabelle's still cheek, her flanks trembling, refusing to move even when the men reached for her bridle. Since that morning, Reverie had been a different creature. The gentleness was gone, replaced by a wild, inconsolable fury. She bit the groom who tried to saddle her. She kicked through the door of her stable. She paced the east paddock in endless frantic circles, her coat dull and matted, her ribs beginning to press through the once lustrous hide. The Duke had ordered that she be kept, fed, and left alone. She was not to be ridden, not to be sold, not to be destroyed. She was the last living thing his sister had loved, and he could not bring himself to make a final decision about her. So Reverie remained, a beautiful ruined animal trapped in her own mourning, and the staff gave her a wide and fearful berth. Everyone avoided the mare, but the mare, it seemed, did not wish to avoid Nell. The first time had been an accident. Nell had been sent to carry a pail of kitchen scraps to the compost heap behind the east stable. The path ran alongside the paddock fence, close enough to hear the grass rustling under the wind, and she had been walking quickly, her head down, her mind elsewhere. She heard the sound before she saw the horse. A low, broken nickering, almost like a question, asked to an empty room. She had looked up to find Reverie standing at the fence, barely 3 feet away. The mare's great dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that stopped Nell's breath in her throat. The other girls would have screamed. Dottie, who worked the laundry, had once fainted at the mere sound of the horse kicking her stable wall. But Nell did not scream. She did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, the pail heavy in her hand, and looked back at the animal. 1 breath, 2, 3. The mare stretched her neck over the fence. Her nostrils flared, drawing in Nell's scent with a slow, searching care. Then, with a tenderness that seemed impossible from so wild a creature, she pressed her velvet muzzle against Nell's shoulder. Nell did not move. She did not reach up. She simply stood there, bearing the warm weight of the horse's head against her collarbone, feeling the slow, unsteady rhythm of the animal's breathing. Reverie closed her eyes. The frantic energy that had driven her for 9 months seemed to drain away like water finding a crack in stone. She exhaled, long and shuddering, and was still. 1. They stayed like that for a full minute, 2 solitary figures in the gray afternoon light. It was Nell who moved first. She shifted the pail gently to her other hand and stepped back. The mare's eyes opened. She watched Nell walk away but did not call after her. Not that time. It happened again the next day and the day after that. Wherever Nell's duties brought her within sight of the east paddock, the horse would come to the fence. She would stand there, quiet and expectant, her ears pricked forward, her dark eyes seeking out the small figure in the black dress. If Nell paused even for a moment, the mare would lean toward her, pressing her muzzle into the hollow of Nell's shoulder with the same gentle, imploring urgency. Nell never lingered. She never fed the horse or stroked her mane. She understood the danger of being noticed, of being singled out any further than she already had been, but the horse's devotion was as impossible to conceal as it was to explain. The stable boy saw it first and told the head groom. The groom told the cook. The cook, who disliked secrets she could not profit from, told everyone. Within a week, the whispers had reached Mrs. Crail. She had summoned Nell to her sitting room that same evening. The room was small and oppressively tidy, every surface reflecting the housekeeper's rigid conviction that order was the highest virtue and deviation from it a kind of sin. "You have been interfering with the mare," Mrs. Crail said. It was not a question. "No, Mrs. Crail, I have not touched the animal." "Then explain to me why she follows you." "I cannot explain it, Mrs. Crail. She comes to the fence when I pass. I have done nothing to encourage it." The housekeeper had studied her for a long, cold moment. Her black eyes were like two chips of polished coal pressed into a face that seemed designed to discourage all forms of hope. "That animal is His Grace's burden," she said, her voice dropping to a hard, dangerous whisper. "She is grief on 4 legs, and it is not your place to meddle with grief that does not belong to you. You will not look at her. You will not approach her. You will change your route to avoid that paddock entirely. If I hear one more word connecting your name to that horse, you will be gone before the sun rises. Do I make myself understood?" "Perfectly, Mrs. Crail." And Nell had obeyed. She had taken the longer path around the south wing, adding a full 10 minutes to every errand. She had kept her eyes fixed on the ground whenever she was outdoors. She had done everything in her power to sever the invisible thread between herself and the horse, but the thread would not be severed. Reverie began to pace the fence line, moving from one end of the paddock to the other in relentless sweeps, her ears swiveling, searching for the footsteps that no longer came. When she caught Nell's scent carried on the wind, she would call out, a high, keening sound that traveled across the stable yard, over the kitchen roof, and into the servants' hall like a living accusation. It was the sound of an animal crying for the one creature who had offered it peace, and it cut through the household like a blade drawn across glass. And now this notice, this public rule, aimed at her alone, delivered in front of every girl in the house. Nell lowered her gaze from the housekeeper's face. She smoothed her apron with steady hands and said nothing. She felt the shape of her situation pressing in on her from every side, a trap with walls she could see but could not shift. She would obey the rule. She had no choice. Her position here was far too fragile, and her true purpose far too vital, to be destroyed over a horse however broken and lonely that horse might be. Her name was not Nell. Her name was Cassia Liddell, and she had come to Howardon Hall not for a serving girl's wages, but for proof that her entire life had been stolen from her. Her father, Everard Liddell, had been one of the most respected antiquarians in the north of England, quiet, meticulous man with gentle hands, and an encyclopedic knowledge of rare manuscripts. He had spent 30 years building a reputation and a modest fortune. His personal collection of annotated first editions, assembled across a lifetime of careful, passionate scholarship, was worth a considerable sum. His property, a small but beautiful estate called Ashwell House in the Cumbrian Hills, had been in the Liddell family for 4 generations, and all of it, every book, every acre, every carefully catalogued page, had been intended for Cassia. She knew this because her father had told her so. Not once, but many times, in the quiet hours of the evening when the two of them sat together in his study, surrounded by the leather-bound volumes that were his life's work. "You are my legacy, Cassia," he would say, his reading glasses perched on his forehead, a half-smile on his kind, weathered face. "These words have outlived empires. They will outlive me, and they are yours." He died 2 years ago, a winter illness that settled deep in his chest and refused to leave, no matter how many doctors came or how many remedies were tried. He was buried in the churchyard at the edge of the village beneath a yew tree he had always admired for its patience, and Cassia had stood at his grave in the frozen January rain with the absolute certainty that she would honor his wishes and continue his work. She had been wrong. Within a month of the funeral, a man named Gideon Crail had appeared. He was a distant cousin of Cassia's late mother, a man her father had met perhaps twice in his life and openly distrusted. He was sleek and well-dressed, with the easy smile of someone who had long ago learned that confidence could substitute for character. He came bearing a document, a revised will dated just 3 weeks before Everard's death. That left everything, the books, the property, the collection in its entirety, to him. Cassia had stared at the paper in disbelief. The handwriting was close to her father's, but not exact. The witnesses were strangers to her. The solicitor who had notarized the document was a man her father had never once mentioned in all their years together. "Your father was a practical man, Miss Lydell," Gideon Crale had told her, his voice rich with manufactured sympathy. He understood that a young woman alone could not manage an estate and a collection of this complexity. He wanted to ensure his life's work was placed in capable, experienced hands. The lie was so brazen, so immaculately dressed in the language of paternal concern, that it had knocked the breath from Cassia's lungs. Her father had spent years training her. He had taught her to catalog, to appraise, to read the condition of a binding by touch alone. He had raised her not as a decorative daughter, but as a fellow scholar. His intellectual heir in every sense. The idea that he would hand his legacy to a man he barely knew and quietly despised was not simply wrong. It was an insult to everything Everard Lydell had stood for. But Gideon Crale had the document, and Cassia had nothing. Her father's original solicitor, a man named Hargrove, who had served the family for 20 years, had retired abruptly and moved abroad within days of the funeral. The new solicitor, clearly Crale's man, refused to grant Cassia an appointment. Within 2 months, Gideon had sold the collection to a series of private buyers, claimed Ashwell House as his own residence, and informed Cassia that she was welcome to take her personal clothing and leave. She had been cast out of her own home with a single trunk, £3 in coin, and a letter of reference so deliberately vague it was practically an accusation. And Mrs. Crale, the iron-spined head housekeeper of Harrowden Hall, the woman who had just assigned Cassia to the scullery and warned her away from the horse in front of 14 other girls, was Gideon Crale's elder sister. Cassia had spent a year in quiet, grinding poverty before the thread that would lead her to Harrowden revealed itself. She had taken work as a seamstress, then as a governess selling her mother's brooch and her father's pocket watch to survive. She was close to the end of her resources when a letter found her, forwarded through a chain of booksellers who remembered the Lydell name. It was from a retired professor named Wyndham, who had been her father's dearest friend. Wyndham did not believe the contested will. He remembered Everard speaking with pride about Cassia and his intention to leave her everything. And he remembered something else. Years earlier, Cassia's father had been commissioned by the old Duke of Harrowden to catalog the estate's magnificent private library. The work had taken 3 summers, and during that time Everard had entrusted certain documents to the Duke's keeping, hidden somewhere in the vast library, far from the reach of anyone who might wish them harm. The old Duke was dead now. His son, Theron, the current Duke, would have no knowledge of the arrangement. The documents, if they still existed, would be buried somewhere in that house, forgotten and gathering dust. It was a thread as thin as spider's silk stretched across a chasm. But it was the only thread Cassia had left, so she had disappeared. Cassia Lydell, the scholar's daughter, the dispossessed gentlewoman, had ceased to exist. And in her place, Nell had been born. A quiet, capable girl with carefully forged references and a plausible story of having been orphaned in the industrial towns to the south, who had applied for temporary work at the household of the Duke of Harrowden in preparation for his midsummer ball. She had been at Harrowden for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of scrubbing flagstones and emptying ash grates and learning the rhythms of the great house, the creak of its floorboards, the draught patterns in its corridors, the cold and distant habits of its master. 3 weeks of mapping, in her mind, every route to the library and every obstacle that stood between her and the room where her future might still be waiting. The library was the Duke's private domain. Theron Ashvale, the 9th Duke of Harrowden, was a man who seemed carved from the same dark stone as the fells surrounding his home. Tall and severe, with hair the color of a raven's wing, he moved through his house with the heavy deliberation of a man carrying a weight no one else could share. His sister's death had hollowed him. He spoke rarely, smiled never, and spent his days at the great desk in the library, governing his estate with a grim focus that left no room for anything else. No servant entered without knocking. No footstep above a whisper was tolerated. The room was his sanctuary. It was the room Cassia needed. And it was the single room in all of Harrowden she could not reach. As a temporary scullery girl, she had no business near the family wing. The ball, she had thought, would be her chance. The house in chaos, attention on the guests. She might slip away for 20 minutes to search the shelves. But the scullery assignment had destroyed that plan. She would be trapped below stairs the entire night, farther from the library than she had ever been. She picked up one of the black serving dresses from the table and held it against herself. It was stiff and cold, and it smelled of starch and someone else's iron. The coarse fabric pressed against her collarbone, against the exact spot where Reverie had rested her velvet head and breathed her broken, trusting breath. Two creatures in this house understood what it meant to lose everything. Two creatures had recognized in each other a grief that required no explanation and no permission. And now, by the stroke of a housekeeper's pen, both had been forbidden from the only comfort either of them had found. Cassia folded the dress over her arm and walked toward the narrow staircase that led to the attic dormitory, where the temporary girls slept in rows of narrow iron cots. Behind her, the whispers had already begun, sharp and busy as sparrows fighting over crumbs. She did not look back. She had learned long ago that looking back was a luxury reserved for people who still had something to return to. The days between the rule and the ball were the hardest Cassia had yet endured at Harrowden. The invisible protection that Reverie's strange loyalty had provided, the way the other girls had kept their distance out of a superstitious fear of drawing the horse's attention, was gone. Without it, Nell was simply the girl the housekeeper despised. And Mrs. Crail's contempt was not a quiet thing. It expressed itself in the language of labor. The morning after the assignments were given, Nell was roused a full hour before the other girls and sent to the cellars to haul blocks of ice from the delivery cart to the cold stores. The blocks were the size of small trunks, wrapped in sawdust and heavy canvas, and they had to be dragged across flagstones, slick with meltwater. By the time the kitchen bell rang for breakfast, her arms were trembling, and her fingers had gone numb and white. She ate alone. She had always eaten alone, but now the distance around her was deliberate, a void the other girls maintained with sidelong glances and careful positioning. They did not speak to her unless a task required it. They did not offer to share the burden of heavy carrying or the tedium of long polishing. She was an island, and Mrs. Crail was the tide that had cut her off from the mainland. After breakfast, she was sent to the north passage to clean the high windows that overlooked the east paddock. It was a task that required a tall ladder, a bucket of vinegar water, and a view she did not want, because from that height she could see Reverie. The mare was pacing, back and forth along the fence line, her silver tail switching, her head turning sharply at every sound. She was searching. Cassia knew it with a certainty that lived in her bones, searching for the footsteps that had stopped coming, for the quiet presence that had made the world, for a few precious, stolen moments, bearable. Cassia pressed her cloth against the glass and scrubbed with a force that made her shoulder ache. She did not let herself watch, but she could hear the horse below, the soft, restless thudding of hooves on turf, and every beat of it landed against her chest like a small, persistent fist. She worked through the day without complaint. She was given the brass fixtures in the grand ballroom to polish. While the room was transformed around her, footmen carried in arrangements of white roses. Great swaths of ivory silk were draped from the ceiling beams, turning the austere hall into something luminous and impossibly fine. Cassia polished and watched the preparations unfold and tried not to think about how close she was to the library. She knew every route, every servant's passage, every shortcut. But knowledge without opportunity was just another form of torment, and Mrs. Crail was ensuring that no opportunity would come. That evening, as the house settled into the charged, breathless quiet that precedes a great event, Cassia was summoned once more to the housekeeper's sitting room. "You have been assigned to additional duties tomorrow evening, Mrs. Marker," Crail said, not raising her eyes from the inventory ledger she was reviewing with a silver-tipped pen. "You will report to the kitchens at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and remain below stairs until the last dish is cleared, the last glass is washed, and the last surface is scrubbed to my satisfaction. You are not to leave the service corridor for any reason. If the house were burning down around you, you would wait for my instruction before moving. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mrs. Crail." "Good. You are dismissed." It was a cage within a cage. Not only was she confined to the scullery, but now she had been given an explicit, unambiguous order to remain there for the entire duration of the ball, from afternoon until the small hours of the morning. Crail was not merely isolating her. She was bricking up every exit. Cassia walked back to the dormitory with measured steps. She was running out of time. After the ball, the temporary staff would be dismissed. She would leave Harrowden with empty hands, and the proof of her stolen life would remain hidden in a room she had never been able to enter. She lay on her narrow iron cot that night, staring at the cracks in the attic ceiling, and listened to the wind moving across the fells outside. Somewhere below and to the east, in the darkness of the paddock, reverie gave a single long, desolate call into the night. Neither of them slept. The Dowager Duchess arrived the following morning, the day of the ball, in a lacquered carriage drawn by 4 matched greys with a coachman who looked as though he had been driving her since the previous century. Lady Sabine Ashvale was 73 years old and in full possession of every faculty. That age is rumored to diminish. Small and straight-backed, with silver hair beneath a traveling hat of dark blue velvet and pale green eyes that missed nothing. She had been the Duchess of Harrowden for 40 years before her husband's death, and regarded the estate with the proprietary sharpness of a woman who knew every corner and every secret. She was met at the front entrance by Mrs. Crail, who curtsied with military precision. "Your Grace, your rooms are prepared. I should hope they are. I wrote a month ago." She swept past the housekeeper into the entrance hall, her gaze traveling over the arrangements with a speed that would have made a lesser woman flinch. Nell was on her knees at the foot of the grand staircase, scrubbing the marble with a horsehair brush. It was another of Mrs. Bree, Crail's carefully timed arrangements designed to ensure that when the Dowager arrived, the first thing she would see was the troublesome temporary girl in the most visible and degrading position the housekeeper could devise. Cassia knew this. She understood the staging, with the same clarity she understood everything Mrs. Crail did. She kept her head bowed, her hands moving in steady, unhurried circles on the cold stone. Lady Sabine stopped walking. Her gaze fell on the kneeling figure and remained there, traveling slowly from the bowed head to the working hands to the worn hem of the black serving dress. "Stand up, child," she said. Nell rose, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. She was acutely aware of Mrs. Crail standing 3 feet behind the Dowager, watching her with the focused predatory intensity of a sparrowhawk. "What is your name, Nell? Your Grace?" "And how long have you been at Harrowden, Nell?" 3 weeks, Your Grace. I was hired for the preparations for the ball." Lady Sabine studied her in silence. Then she reached out and took Nell's right hand, turning it over to examine the palm. The hand was reddened and rough, the knuckles swollen, but the fingers were long and tapering, and beneath the damage there was a fineness of bone that no amount of hard labor could erase. "You have been working very hard," the Dowager said softly. It was not a question, and it was not addressed to Nell. Her sharp green gaze had shifted over her shoulder to Mrs. Crail. The words landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "All the temporary staff are expected to earn their positions, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied, her voice carefully, meticulously neutral. Evidently, Lady Sabine released Nell's hand and gave her a small, unreadable nod. "You may return to your work, child." Nell curtsied and sank back to her knees, but her pulse was racing beneath her composed exterior. The dowager had looked at her hands the way Cassia's father used to examine a book's binding, not at the surface damage but at the structure beneath, searching for the original craftsmanship hidden under years of wear. Later that morning, Theron was summoned to his mother's rooms. He found her in the window alcove, watching the gardeners set lanterns along the terrace. "You look dreadful," she said. "Good morning to you as well, Mother. Sit down. I wish to speak with you about your housekeeper." Theron remained standing, his expression settling into polite resistance. "Mrs. Crail has served this family with distinction for nearly 2 decades, he said. "I am aware of how long she has served. I am questioning how well." Lady Sabine fixed her son with a gaze that had reduced far more formidable men to compliance. "There is a girl scrubbing your entrance hall. She has the hands of a gentlewoman and the bearing of one too, though someone has gone to trouble to make her look otherwise. And the horse, Rosabelle's mare." Her voice softened at her daughter's name. "The one creature showing any sign of recovering from its grief, because this girl calmed her. And your housekeeper's response was to forbid any contact. Reverie is dangerous," Theron said. His jaw had tightened perceptibly. "The rule was a matter of safety. The rule was a matter of control," his mother said quietly. "Mrs. Crail does not care about that horse's welfare, and you know it. She cares about anything that disrupts the order of her domain, and this girl disrupts it simply by existing." She rose from the window seat and walked toward her son, her small frame somehow commanding the entire room. "You are hosting a ball tonight, Theron. 300 guests. Music, dancing, all the ceremonies of a world that insists on continuing to turn however much you might wish it would stop. Your sister loved these evenings. She would have been the first onto the floor and the last to leave it." She placed her hand on his arm, and her voice dropped to something gentler and more dangerous than anger. "Do not allow your grief to become that woman's instrument. The girl has done nothing wrong, and the horse knows it. I suspect, if you are honest with yourself, that you know it too." Theron did not answer. His mother's words had found the exact fracture that had been widening inside him since the evening. He stood at his library window and watched a small figure in a black dress send a grieving horse away, not out of fear, but out of obedience to a rule she knew was unjust. He left his mother's rooms without responding, but the question she had planted behind his ribs was already taking root, pushing its way upward toward the light. The ball began at 8 o'clock on a warm evening in late June, and Harrowden Hall blazed with light. Every window on the south front was illuminated. The long gravel drive was lined with carriage lamps, and the sound of wheels and arriving voices filled the summer air. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed. 1,000 candles burned in the crystal chandeliers, their light falling on ivory silk, white roses, and the gleaming parquet floor where 300 guests would soon begin to dance. The orchestra struck their opening chord. The Duke was expected, by tradition, to lead the first dance, but word had rippled through the guests that His Grace had declined. He had retreated to the far end of the hall, a tall, dark, solitary figure refusing the ritual his sister had once cherished. The first dance was given over to the guests, and a murmur of disappointment moved through the room. Footmen in powdered wigs took their positions with silver trays of champagne. The warm air smelled of beeswax and French perfume and the sweet green fragrance of the gardens drifting in through the open terrace doors. Cassia heard none of it. She was below stairs, in the stone-walled scullery, standing at a basin of water so hot it had turned her hands the angry color of raw brick. The crystal arrived in crates and did not stop. Champagne cubes, claret glasses, water goblets, each washed, dried, inspected, and sent back upstairs. The kitchen around her was a roaring furnace of noise and motion. She worked mechanically. Above her head, through the thick stone ceiling, She could feel the vibration of the music. The orchestra was playing a waltz. The ball was alive, and she was buried beneath it like a root beneath a flower. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. 9 o'clock. 10. The pace in the kitchen did not ease. Supper was served at 10:30, a grand, formal affair of 7 courses that sent a fresh avalanche of porcelain and silver cascading down the service stairs in the arms of perspiring footmen. Cassia washed and dried and stacked and washed again, her back aching, her fingers pruned and raw and tender at the tips. It was nearly midnight when the accident happened. A footman named Sefton, carrying a crate of champagne glasses up the narrow service stairs, caught his heel on the worn 3rd step. The crate pitched forward and hit the wall with a sound like a chandelier striking marble. 30 glasses exploded into glittering fragments. The kitchen froze. The cook swore. The junior housekeeper rushed to the staircase. 2 maids were summoned with brooms. The footman, bleeding from a cut on his palm, was sent for bandaging. For perhaps 3 minutes, every pair of eyes in the service corridor was fixed on the wreckage. Cassia did not think. She simply moved. She dried her hands, stepped away from the basin, and walked through the kitchen door. She did not run. Men. She walked with the measured stride of a girl on an urgent errand, past the larder, past the housekeeper's corridor. She pushed through the baize door that separated the servants' world from the family's, and stepped into the great hall. The contrast nearly knocked her backward. The hall was a cathedral of golden light and cascading sound. She could see the edge of the dance floor, the slow turning of couples, the flash of candlelight on jewels, beautiful, dizzying, and entirely irrelevant. She turned left and walked swiftly to the library. The door was closed, but not locked. She slipped inside and pulled it shut behind her. The room was dark, save for moonlight through the tall windows. It smelled of leather and old paper and the quiet, patient presence of 10,000 books waiting in the darkness. She had perhaps 10 minutes. She crossed to the spiral staircase and climbed to the upper gallery. Her fingers trailed over the spines of the books, the classical collection assembled by the old Duke's grandfather. Aristotle, Seneca, Herodotus. She was looking for her father's technique, a false spine, a hollowed volume, a concealed panel. Her fingers moved with desperate speed, pressing each volume, testing each joint between the shelves. Her hands were shaking. The music from the ballroom pulsed faintly through the walls like the heartbeat of the house itself, each measure a reminder that above her, around her, beyond the walls of this dark and silent room, 300 people were laughing and dancing and living their bright, undamaged lives. Tamar, a girl, was fighting for the last shred of proof that her own life had ever been real. A floorboard groaned somewhere below. Cassia froze. Her fingers stopped on the spine of a volume of Herodotus. She pressed herself flat against the shelves, making her body as narrow and as still as the books themselves, and held her breath. She strained to listen, her own heartbeat so thunderous in her ears it seemed impossible that it could not be heard in every room of the house. Silence, a silence so deep it had texture like velvet pressed against her face. Then, soft and unmistakable, the sound of the library door being opened and closed. Someone had entered the room. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Cassia did not breathe. She pressed herself into the shelves on the upper gallery and listened. The darkness was near total. She heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, measured, not a servant's brisk tread or Mrs. Crale's sharp heels. These were the footsteps of a man who knew every inch of this room. A match was struck. A lamp flared to life on the mantelpiece, casting a warm circle of gold across the lower floor. In the light, she saw him. The Duke of Harrowden, still in his evening clothes, his tailcoat unbuttoned, his cravat loosened. He looked like a man who had escaped from something. He set the match down and turned toward his desk. Then he stopped. His head came up with a slow, watchful precision. His dark eyes moved to the spiral staircase, then upward along the gallery, "I know someone is there," he said. His voice was quiet, but carried the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being answered. Cassia closed her eyes. She had two choices. Silence was the coward's option, and the one most likely to fail. He was not a man who doubted his own senses. She stepped forward to the gallery railing. The lamplight caught her face. "Come down," he said. There was no anger in his voice. Something colder, a deep, patient curiosity. She descended the spiral staircase and stood before him, hands clasped, head bowed. "Look at me," he said. She raised her eyes. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were alive, sharp and searching, examining her as though she were a document in an unexpected language. "What are you doing in my library?" he asked. She said nothing. What could she say? The truth would end everything. A lie would insult them both. "Were you stealing?" "No." "Your Grace." Her voice was steady, and the steadiness surprised her. "Then what?" A pause. "A midnight stroll through the philosophy section." The question carried a blade of sarcasm, but there was something beneath it. He had noted where she had been. The philosophy section, not the silver cabinet, not his desk drawers, not the obvious targets of a common thief. She had been standing among Aristotle and Seneca and Herodotus in the furthest, most obscure corner of the gallery, and that fact was clearly troubling him. "I was looking for a book," she said. It was the truth, or a fragment of it, and she let it stand alone in the silence between them. He studied her for a long moment. Then he took a step closer. "Which section were you searching?" This was the test. She could feel it. He was measuring the distance between what a scullery maid should know and what this particular scullery maid actually knew. And the answer would determine everything. She could lie. Manned. She could say she had wandered upstairs, out of curiosity, and touched the first shelf she found. It would be plausible. It would be safe. It would also be the end of her search, because he would never let her near this room again. Or she could tell the truth. Not all of it, but enough. "The classical philosophy collection," she said, her voice clear and unhesitating. "The section assembled by your grandfather, the 7th Duke. It is organized by period, rather than author, pre-Socratic through late Stoic, with the Roman commentaries shelved separately in the alcove to the left of the gallery window." The silence that followed was so complete. She could hear the distant hum of the orchestra 2 rooms away, playing a minuet for dancers who had no idea what was unfolding in this dark, book-lined room. Theron's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A door that had been closed was now open, and behind it was a question he had not been prepared to ask. "How do you know that?" he said. His voice had lost its sarcasm. What remained was raw, unguarded astonishment. "I read about the collection," she said. "Your grandfather's catalog is referenced in several scholarly works on private libraries of the Georgian period." It was a careful, precise answer. It was also, he suspected, a masterful deflection. A scullery maid who read scholarly works on Georgian private libraries was no more plausible than a scullery maid who wandered into the philosophy section at midnight for pleasure. He walked to his desk and picked up a volume that lay open on its surface. It was a slim edition of Virgil, bound in dark red morocco, the pages edged in gold. He opened it to a passage near the middle and held it out to her. "Read," he said. She took the book. Her hands trembled, but her fingers found the page with the easy familiarity of someone who had held 1,000 books and knew how to let them fall open without force. She looked at the Latin text, took a breath, and began to read. Her voice was hesitant at first, thin and uncertain, but the rhythm of the language caught her, the way it always had since childhood, since her father first read these same words to her by candlelight in his study at Ashwell House, and her voice found its strength. The ancient words filled the library with a sound that had not been heard within its walls for years. The clear, confident cadence of a trained and practiced scholar reading a text she understood not just with her mind, but with her heart. She read the entire passage. When she finished, She lowered the book and looked up at him. He was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on any human face, a look of dawning, reluctant, almost painful recognition. He had expected her to stumble. He had expected the test to expose a fraud. Instead, it had exposed something far more unsettling, a truth that his ordered, rational mind could not reconcile with the girl standing before him in a servant's black dress with red, ruined hands. He took the book from her. Their fingers brushed, and the contact sent a shock through both of them, brief and electric, and impossible to ignore. "Who are you?" he asked. It was not the question of a master to a servant. It was the question of one human being to another, stripped of station and expectation, and spoken with a directness that left no room for evasion. The truth was on the tip of her tongue. "My name is Cassia Lydell. My father cataloged this very library. The proof of my stolen life is hidden somewhere in this room, and I have risked everything to find it. But the fear was stronger. The fear of 2 years of dispossession, of powerlessness, of learning through bitter experience that truth without proof was just another form of helplessness. He held absolute power over her. A single word from him could destroy the last thread of hope she had left. "I am a housemaid, Your Grace," she said, and dropped her gaze to the floor. He watched her for a long, silent moment. The lamplight flickered between them. "Mrs. Crale will say you are a thief," he said, his voice low and strained. "She will demand your dismissal. What do you expect me to do?" Cassia lifted her chin. She met his eyes, and in the dim golden light she let him see, for just an instant, the person she truly was. Not a servant, not a thief, a woman who had been robbed of everything and was still standing. "I expect you to do what is just, Your Grace," she said quietly. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Something deeper. A recognition. A shift in the foundation of how he saw her and, perhaps, how he saw himself. "Go back to your room," he said. His voice was rough, as though the words cost him something. "Speak of this to no one. I will deal with Mrs. Crale." Cassia curtsied. She turned and walked to the door, her heart no longer hammering with fear but with something far more dangerous and far more terrifying hope. She had not been dismissed. She had not been denounced. She had been seen. For the first time in 2 years, someone had looked past the uniform and the scrubbing brush and the damaged hands and seen the person underneath. And that, she knew, as she climbed the dark stairs back to her attic cot, was a kind of danger she had not prepared for. Theron did not sleep. After Cassia left the library, he stood motionless by his desk for a long time, the book of Virgil still in his hand. The room felt different. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged with the echo of her voice, with the impossible, undeniable fact of a scullery maid who read Latin like a professor and knew the cataloging system of his grandfather's private collection with the precision of someone who had studied it for years. Who was she? He thought of her face in the lamplight, pale and frightened, but beneath the fear, an architecture of composure so deeply built it could not be dismantled by threat or interrogation. He thought of her hands, the scholar's fingers beneath the scullery damage. He thought of Reverie, who had not tolerated a kind touch from any living soul since Rosabelle's death, pressing her muzzle against this girl's shoulder with the trust of an animal that had found something it recognized. His mother's words returned to him. She has the hands of a gentlewoman and the bearing of one too, though someone has gone to considerable trouble to make her look otherwise. Mrs. Crale. He would have to deal with her before morning, but not yet. Not until he understood more. He sat down at his desk and pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him. He dipped his pen and began to write a letter, not to the housekeeper, but to an old acquaintance in London, a man with a quiet reputation for finding information that other people wished to keep hidden. He described the girl as carefully as he could, her approximate age, her appearance, the names she used, her fluency in classical languages, and her knowledge of rare book collections. He asked the man to search for any record of a young woman of education and gentle birth who had disappeared from her former life within the last 2 or 3 years. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning post. Then he sat in the lamplight alone, with the books and the silence, and a feeling he had not experienced since before Rosabel's death, the fierce, sharp-edged instinct to protect something that was in danger. Mrs. Crale arrived at the library door at 7 o'clock the following morning, her face arranged in grim triumph. "Your Grace, I must report a serious breach." The temporary girl, Nell, was discovered attempting to steal from this room last night. I observed her leaving the servants' quarters after midnight. I followed her and found her here. A lie, a brazen, foolish lie. Saren had been in a library. He had been the one to discover her. Mrs. Crale had been nowhere near the room. You followed her personally. His voice was dangerously soft. "I did. Your Grace, she is a thief. She must be dismissed." She was confident, standing before him with the assurance of a woman who had never once had her word questioned by the master of this house. Theron let the silence stretch. "Your vigilance is noted, Mrs. Crale. However, you are mistaken." A crack appeared in her composure. "I was in this library last night," Theron said, his voice level and cold. The girl did not break in. I summoned her. I required a volume from the upper gallery. She retrieved it and returned to her duties. There was no theft. There was only a servant following a direct order, the color drained from her face. She understood. Her authority was being overridden. "But, Your Grace, her behavior has been deeply concerning. The horse, the secrecy. She is not what she presents herself to be. Her behavior," Theron said, his voice hardening to flint, "has been exemplary. The matter of the horse is closed. I have rescinded the notice. The girl will not be dismissed. She will not be punished. She will continue her work in the regular rotation and will be retained on the permanent household staff. And you, Mrs. Crale, will not trouble her further. Are my instructions clear?" For a moment, she looked as though she might argue, but one look at the Duke's face told her it would be fatal. "Yes, Your Grace," she whispered. "You may go." She curtsied stiffly and left the room. Theron watched her go and felt no triumph, only a heavy disappointment. He had trusted this woman, and she had lied to his face to destroy a girl whose only offense was being different. The shift in the household was immediate. By the time Cassia descended to the kitchens that morning, the atmosphere had already changed. The whispers were different now, charged with a new energy. The Duke had personally intervened to save a temporary scullery maid from the housekeeper's wrath. The story spread through the servants' hall like fire through dry grass, growing larger and more elaborate with every telling. The notice about reverie had vanished from the kitchen door. No one mentioned it. It had simply ceased to exist, as though it had been a bad dream the house had collectively agreed to forget. That afternoon, as Cassia was carrying linens through the east corridor, a familiar sound reached her ears. The soft thudding of hooves, not frantic and searching, but steady and deliberate, moving toward the fence. She turned and looked through the passage window. Reverie was standing at the paddock rail, her silver head lifted, her dark eyes fixed on the window where Cassia stood. The mare nickered softly. It was not the anguished, keening cry of the past weeks. It was a sound of quiet recognition. "I see you. You are here." Cassia pressed her fingers against the glass. She could not go to her. Not yet. There were still eyes watching, still suspicions circling. But something had changed. Some invisible barrier had been lifted, and the horse seemed to feel it too. Reverie lowered her head and began to graze, calmly, peacefully, her silver tail swishing in the warm afternoon light. It was the first time anyone had seen the mare eat without pacing in 9 months. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality. Mrs. Crale did not speak to Cassia directly. She issued her orders through the junior housekeeper, her face a permanent mask of tightly controlled fury. The punitive assignment ceased. Kasia was placed on the regular rotation, mostly in the upper floors, in the family wing. Whether this was the Duke's doing or Mrs. Sale, Krail's way of keeping a perceived threat within sight, Kasia could not tell. The Duke himself remained a distant figure. When he passed her in the corridor, he would give a curt nod, his expression unreadable, but his eyes would rest on her for a fraction of a second longer than protocol allowed. And sometimes, when she was dusting the shelves in the library and he sat working at his desk, she would look up and find him watching her, a question in his dark gaze that he seemed unable or unwilling to speak aloud. These silent, charged encounters became the new rhythm of their days. An unspoken conversation was taking place between them in the narrow spaces between their prescribed roles. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, and she knew it, and the knowledge was equal parts comfort and terror. One afternoon, the Dowager summoned her again. Lady Sabine was in the morning room, reverie visible through the window below, grazing peacefully. "Close the door, child. Sit. My son has taken an extraordinary interest in you," the Dowager said. "He has overruled his housekeeper, rescinded a rule, and personally guaranteed your position. Theron would sooner rearrange the stars than interfere in a household matter. Yet here we are." She turned and fixed Kasia with a gaze both sharp and warm. "You are not what you appear to be. I say this as a woman who recognizes the difference between a person in their rightful place and a person enduring a place that was forced upon them." Kasia's throat tightened. "I cannot say, Your Grace. Not yet." "Very well. But when you are ready, there are those who will hear you. That horse is one, I am another, and I believe my son is the third." Meanwhile, Theron was conducting his own investigation. He searched the library methodically, running his hands along the shelves the way he had seen her do, pressing panels, testing joints. He found nothing, but the search was changing him. Each hour among the books was an hour retracing her steps, trying to understand what drove a young woman of obvious education to disguise herself as a scullery maid. He pulled down the library's registry, and there, in a clear academic hand dated 8 years earlier, he found a name: Everard Liddell, antiquarian and classical scholar, commissioned to catalogue the Harrowden collection by His Grace the 8th Duke. He wrote it down and added it to his inquiry. The letter from London arrived 11 days after the ball. Theron broke the seal. The investigator had found no servant named Nell, but a wider search had uncovered the story of Miss Kasia Liddell, only daughter of the late Everard Liddell. A young woman of good family, fluent in Latin, raised as her father's intellectual heir. 2 years prior, a contested will had surfaced. A cousin named Gideon Krail had produced a revised testament. The original solicitor had vanished. Miss Liddell had been dispossessed and had disappeared. The letter included a physical description: slender, dark hair, gray-green eyes, quiet, dignified. Theron set the letter down. Liddell, Kasia Liddell, the name in the library registry. Everard Liddell's daughter, and Krail, Gideon Krail, Mrs. Krail's brother. The full architecture of it rose before him like a building revealing itself through clearing fog. She had come here, into the house governed by her enemy's sister, disguised as the lowest kind of servant, to search for the proof that her life had been stolen. The proof she believed her father had hidden in this very library, entrusted to a duke who was now dead, and a son who had known nothing about it. The courage of it staggered him. The sheer, reckless, magnificent bravery of walking into the lion's den and scrubbing its floors on her knees, while the lion's keeper stood over her with a whip. He stood up and returned to the upper gallery. He searched with a new focus now, not randomly, but with purpose. He was looking for the kind of hiding place a scholar would use, a man who loved books and understood their construction intimately. He examined every shelf in the classical section, pressing, tapping, sliding his fingers behind the volumes. He worked for hours, the light shifting from morning gray to the gold of early afternoon. He found it behind a section of Seneca's letters. A wooden panel that appeared fixed was in fact a narrow door on concealed hinges, locked with a small brass mechanism. He fetched a letter opener and worked the lock until it yielded with a soft, decisive click. The panel swung open. Behind it was a shallow cavity lined with cedar. Inside, covered in dust, lay a leather portfolio, tied with a faded ribbon and a single beautifully bound volume with gilt edging. He carried them down to his desk and opened the portfolio first. Inside was a sheaf of letters in a clear, meticulous hand, and beneath them, a deed. A deed of title for a property called Ashwell House in the county of Cumberland, listing the sole and uncontested beneficiary as my beloved daughter, Cassia Margaret Liddell. Then he opened the book. It was a first edition of the Aeneid, extraordinarily rare, worth a sum that would make most men's hands tremble. Tucked inside the front cover was a letter, addressed to the 8th Duke of Harrowden in Everard Liddell's unmistakable hand. "My Lord Duke," it began, "I fear my health is failing, and I write to you as both a friend and a man of honor. I have placed this portfolio in your keeping because I have come to distrust certain members of my late wife's family, particularly her cousin, Mr. Gideon Crail, who has shown an unseemly interest in my affairs. Should anything befall me, I beg you to see that these documents are delivered into the hands of my daughter Cassia. She is all I have in this world, and this collection, this house, and these papers are her birthright. The book is a small token of my immense gratitude for your friendship and your patronage. It has been the privilege of my life to work among the treasures of Harrowden." Theron sat. As the room grew dark, the papers spread before him, and felt the full weight of his family's failure. His father had been entrusted with a dying man's most sacred wish, and with his own death, the trust had been broken. The documents had been forgotten behind a panel 3 feet from his desk, and the daughter for whom they were meant had spent 2 years in poverty, while the proof of her rightful life gathered dust. A cold rage settled in his chest, a rage on Cassia's behalf, at the injustice, at the thief who had stolen her world, at the housekeeper who had ground her into the flagstones, and at his own blindness. He knew what he had to do. He could not simply hand her the papers. That would be charity, and charity was not what she was owed. She was owed recognition. She was owed the restoration of her name in the presence of the woman who had conspired, knowingly or not, to erase it. He rang the bell. When the footman appeared, Theron's voice was quiet and hard as iron. "Find Mrs. Crail. Then find the girl. Nell, bring them both to me. Here now." The walk to the library was the longest journey of Cassia's life. The footman who found her was pale and visibly unsettled. "The Duke requires you in the library. He has also sent for Mrs. Crail." The words hit her like cold water. She set down the cloth she had been using to wipe the morning-room windows and followed the footman through the corridors on legs that felt as though they belonged to someone else. Reverie, sensing something from her paddock, lifted her head and watched through the passage window as Cassia passed. The mare's dark eyes followed her with a steady, unwavering attention, as though she were willing strength across the distance. Mrs. Crail was already in the library when Cassia arrived. The housekeeper stood before the Duke's desk, her spine rigid, her face a mask of stone. But there was a flicker of something in her black eyes, a guarded, wary light. She did not know why she had been summoned, but she sensed danger the way an animal senses a change in the weather before the storm arrives. Then Cassia saw the desk, the leather portfolio, the faded ribbon, the gilt-edged book, with its burgundy binding, her father's Aeneid. She would have known it from across a crowded room, from across a county, from the other side of the world. It was the book he had loved above all others. The book he had read to her on winter evenings when the fire burned low, and the world outside was dark and cold and far away. Her breath stopped, her vision blurred. She gripped the doorframe to keep herself upright. The Duke stood as she entered. He did not look at Mrs. Crail. His dark eyes found Cassia, and they held an expression she had never seen on his severe, controlled face. It was remorse. A deep, raw, unguarded remorse that transformed his features as completely as lamplight transforms a dark room. "Come in," he said. "Close the door." She obeyed. She walked to the desk on legs she could not feel, her gaze locked on the portfolio, on the handwriting she could see through the open flap, her father's handwriting, the familiar, beloved, precise letters she had not seen in 2 years. Reverie was standing at the window now, visible through the glass, her silver form still and watchful, a silent witness. Theron turned to the housekeeper. His face hardened, the granite returning, cold and absolute. "Mrs. Crail, you told me that this girl attempted to steal from this room. You lied." The housekeeper's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "She was not stealing," the Duke continued, his voice low and measured and merciless. "She was searching. Searching for what was taken from her. Searching for what your brother stole. He picked up the deed from the desk. He did not hand it to Cassia. He held it up so that Mrs. Crail could see the name written upon it." "Do you recognize the name Everard Lydell?" he asked. The remaining color left Mrs. Crail's face, as though it had been wiped away with a cloth. She stared at the document, and her composure, the rigid, armored composure she had maintained for 18 years, began to crack like ice on a warming river. "Everard Lydell was a scholar," the Duke said, his voice relentless. "He was a friend of my father's. He catalogued this very library. He had a daughter who was cheated of her inheritance by a forged will produced by your brother Gideon Crail. A daughter who was cast from her own home with nothing. A daughter who came to this house disguised as a servant and was put on her knees to scrub floors by the very woman whose family had destroyed her life." He let the words hang in the air. They filled the library the way smoke fills a closed room, inescapable and suffocating. Then he turned to Cassia, and for the first time in the presence of another person, he spoke her name, her real name. "Is that not so, Miss Lydell?" The sound of it broke something open inside her that she had kept sealed shut for 2 years. Her name, spoken aloud in this room in her father's library, by a man who had found her truth and chosen to honor it. She was no longer Nell. She was no longer the nameless, invisible girl in the black dress. She was Cassia Lydell, Everard's daughter, and someone had finally, at last, seen her. Tears she had held back through 2 years of poverty and humiliation, and silence spilled down her cheeks. She could not speak. She could only nod. Mrs. Crail made a sound like something breaking, a dry, strangled sob that contained no remorse, only the sound of a woman watching the architecture of her entire life collapse around her. "I did not know," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "My brother told me the father had debts. He said the girl was grasping, that she had no rightful claim. I believed him." "You believed him," Theron repeated, and there was no pity in his voice. "You believed him, because it was convenient, because it cost you nothing. And then you came here, and you saw this girl in your household. And instead of asking a single question, you set about destroying her. You posted rules to isolate her. You assigned her to the worst duties in the house. You lied to my face to have her dismissed." He paused. "You saw her dignity, and you called it defiance. You saw her endurance, and you called it cunning. You mistook her silence for guilt because it was easier than examining your own." He looked from the broken housekeeper to the weeping young woman beside her. When his gaze rested on Cassia, the severity in his face softened, and what replaced it was something that looked very much like reverence. "This house has failed you, Miss Lydell," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to conceal. "My father was entrusted with your future, and he took that trust to his grave without fulfilling it. I have been master of this house, and under my roof, a woman of character and learning has been made to scrub my floors, while the woman who profited from her ruin stood over her with a set of rules and a ring of keys. That is a debt that weighs more than any ledger I have ever opened. He picked up the portfolio and the book and placed them on the edge of the desk closest to Cassia. "These are yours," he said. "They always were." Cassia pressed her hands to her face and wept. Not with the thin, desperate tears of despair she had shed alone in rented rooms and cold attics. These were tears of release, vast and uncontrollable, the kind that come when a burden carried so long it has become part of the body is finally, mercifully, set down. Mrs. Crail stood perfectly still, diminished, hollowed, a woman who had built her world on rules and order and rigid, unquestioning certainty, only to discover that the foundation beneath it was rotten. "What will you do with me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Theron looked at her for a long time. He thought of what would be easy. Dismissal, without reference. A letter to the magistrate, the public humiliation she had so readily planned for Cassia. It would be satisfying. It would be proportionate. But he looked at Cassia's face, at the tears that were not tears of triumph, but of grief and gratitude and the overwhelming relief of finally being known, and he understood that vengeance was not what she would want. It was not what the moment deserved. "You will pack your belongings," he said, his voice weary but steady. "A carriage will take you to the dower house. My mother will arrange a position for you at one of the remote holdings. You will have a cottage and a small pension. You will live quietly. It is considerably more mercy than you extended to Miss Lydell, and it is offered not for your sake, but because the woman you persecuted has more grace in her silence than you showed in all your years of authority." He did not need to say anything more. He had taken her power, her position, her pride. He had left her standing in the ruins of her own making, with nothing but the truth she had refused to see. The footman was called. Mrs. Crail. A stooped and silent figure stripped of every certainty she had ever possessed was led from the room. Theron and Cassia were left alone in the library, with the sleeping afternoon light falling through the tall windows and the portfolio and the book lying between them on the desk like an offering and a promise. Cassia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. The word felt absurdly small against the enormity of what had just happened. "It is I who should be thanking you," he said. He came around the desk and stood before her, closer than he had ever stood, close enough that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the way the afternoon light caught the dark of his hair. "You came into this house of grief and silence and showed me what courage looks like. You endured without complaint. You refused to be diminished. You reminded me that justice is not something that happens in ledgers and courtrooms. It happens in the way we see the people standing in front of us." He paused. His voice, when he spoke again, was rough. "I was too blind to see you. I will not make that mistake again." He did not touch her. He did not reach for her hand. Instead, he simply gestured toward the portfolio and the book, the sum total of her stolen legacy, resting on the desk in the warm light. "Welcome home, Miss Lydell," he said. 4 months later, autumn had come to Harrowden, and the fells wore their finest gold. The estate was changed, not in its stone or its structure, but in its atmosphere, its breath. The corridors that had been heavy with grief now hummed with a quiet, purposeful warmth. The library, once a fortress of silence, was alive again, with the sound of books being moved and shelves being restored, and the low, careful conversation of people who loved the work they were doing. Cassia stood on the rolling ladder in the upper gallery, carefully placing a restored volume back onto a freshly polished shelf. She was no longer wearing the black cotton dress of a servant. She wore a simple gown of soft green wool that matched her eyes, and her dark hair was pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, free of the servant's cap that had hidden it for so long. She was not the mistress of Harrowden. Not yet. She was something perhaps more important to her. She was its librarian, its curator, the guardian of the collection her father had once catalogued and loved. After the unmasking, Theron had made her an offer. Her property in Cumberland had been recovered through legal proceedings, and his solicitors were pursuing the funds from the sale of her father's stolen collection. She was a woman of independent means again, free to leave, free to begin her life anew wherever she chose. But he had asked her to stay. "This library was my father's pride," he had said, standing in this very room, his characteristic formality barely concealing the deeper current beneath his words. "It has fallen into neglect since his death, and my own expertise is in agriculture, not antiquarian scholarship. It needs a curator. It needs your father's daughter." He had paused, and something in his dark eyes had shifted, becoming at once more vulnerable and more certain. "There is a suite of rooms in the East Wing. You would be your own mistress, answerable to no one if you were willing." She had accepted. The arrangement gave her a purpose, a place, and, most importantly, time. Time for the fragile, unspoken thing growing between them to find its shape without the pressure of declaration or expectation. Her days were now spent in the room she had once entered as a trespasser, surrounded by the books that were her inheritance in every sense. She was bringing the collection back to life, restoring bindings, correcting the catalog, uncovering treasures that had been misplaced or forgotten for decades. Under her care, the library was becoming the heart of Harrowden again, not a mausoleum of grief, but a living, breathing testament to the power of knowledge and the persistence of love. She heard the library door open and looked down from the ladder to see Theron entering below. He was changed too, in ways that were visible to anyone who had known him before. The permanent black of mourning had given way to country clothes in warmer tones. The severe lines of his face had softened, not into ease exactly, but into something less defended, less braced against the world. He smiled occasionally now, a slow, slight movement of his mouth that transformed his entire face, and each time she saw it, Cassia felt something warm and dangerous bloom beneath her ribs. "The new shelving has arrived from the joiner in the village," he said, looking up at her. "I saw it this morning," she replied, smiling down at him. "Mr. Tavish has done beautiful work. The grain matches the original panels almost exactly." "He works well under your direction," Theron observed. "The entire estate does. You command more loyalty than Mrs. Crail managed in 2 decades, and you have done it without posting a single rule." They did not speak of the former housekeeper. The dowager had arranged the quiet banishment, and the house had healed around the wound with the slow, patient thoroughness of a forest reclaiming a cleared field. A new housekeeper, a kind and competent woman named Mrs. Allenby, now ran the household. She had been recommended by Cassia. "Will you walk with me?" Theron said. "The light on the lake is exceptional today, of course." She descended the ladder, and he offered his hand to help her down the final step. His touch was warm and firm and unhurried, and it sent the same electric tremor through her that it had on the night in the library when their fingers first brushed over a book of Virgil. These small gestures were the vocabulary of their courtship, quiet and deliberate, a language built from shared glances across the dinner table, from books left open on his desk at passages he wanted her to read, from walks through the gardens where their shoulders almost touched but never quite did. They left the house through the east door. Reverie saw them from the paddock and trotted to the fence, her silver coat gleaming in the autumn sun. The mare was transformed. Her ribs no longer showed. Her mane, groomed and lustrous, rippled in the breeze. She was no longer the haunted, skeletal creature pacing the fence in anguished circles. She was alive again, vital and calm, and when Cassia paused to stroke her velvet muzzle, the horse closed her eyes and leaned into the touch with a trust so complete it needed no explanation. They walked in comfortable silence along the path that curved through the parkland toward the lake. The fells rose around them in their autumn finery, amber and russet and deep-shadowed green, and the sky above was the clear, luminous blue that comes only in October when the air has been washed clean by the first rains. "The solicitors believe the final settlement from the Crail estate will be concluded within the month," Theron said, breaking the silence with the careful formality he used when approaching a subject that mattered to him deeply. The original collection cannot be fully recovered, but the financial restitution will be substantial. You will be a woman of considerable means, Cassia." He had begun using her given name 6 weeks earlier, quietly, in the privacy of the library. The first time he had said it, the single word had carried more weight than any formal speech. "I have all the means I need," she said softly, looking at the lake, at the house standing golden in the distance, at the man walking beside her. "I did not come to Harrowden for money." He stopped on the path and turned to face her. The autumn light was behind him, catching the dark of his hair and warming the sharp lines of his face into something almost gentle. "I am a methodical man, Cassia," he said. His voice was low, steady, but beneath the steadiness she could hear the faintest tremor, the sound of a man stepping off solid ground. "I do not make decisions lightly in farming or in any other matter. I observe. I consider. I wait until I am certain it is, I am told, an infuriating quality." He took both of her hands in his fingers closed around hers with a firmness that said he had no intention of letting go. "But I find that my patience, which has served me well in every other area of my life, has reached its absolute limit in one. I have grown accustomed to your presence in this house, to your voice in the library, to the sight of you on that ladder, surrounded by books, looking as though you were placed there by some force that understood exactly where you belonged. The thought of those things being absent is not something I am willing to contemplate." He took a breath. The tremor was gone. What remained was certainty. "I am asking you to stay, Cassia. Not as my curator, not as a guest of this house, as my wife, as the Duchess of Harrowden." The world went very still. The wind paused. The lake held its breath. Even Reverie, distant by the fence, stood motionless with her silver head raised, as though the whole estate understood that this moment had been building since the night a scullery maid stood in a dark library and read Latin by lamplight. Cassia looked at the man before her, the grieving, severe, impossibly just Duke, who had been too blind to see her until a broken horse showed him the way. The man who had searched his own library for her truth, who had spoken her name when she had forgotten how to speak it herself, who had offered her not charity but recognition, the one thing no amount of money could buy. "Theron," she said, speaking his name for the first time. The word felt like a key turning in a lock. "I have been waiting for you to ask." A smile broke across his face. Not the slight cautious tilting of his lips she had come to treasure over these past months. A real smile, wide and unguarded and radiant, the kind of smile that remade a severe face into something beautiful. "Then I have been inexcusably slow," he said, "and you have been impossibly patient, and we are both, I think, exactly where we are supposed to be." He did not kiss her. That was not his way. Not yet, not here on the open path where the gardeners might see. Instead, he raised her hands and pressed his lips to her fingers, a gesture so tender and so deliberate that it said everything a kiss would have said and more. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had found each other in the dark and chosen, quietly and without spectacle, to walk into the light together. That evening, Theron did something that surprised the entire county. He announced an autumn ball, the first social event at Harrowden since the midsummer ball that had changed everything. The invitations were sent within the week. The household, under Mrs. Pratt, Allenby's cheerful direction, threw itself into preparations with an energy the old walls had not seen in years. On the night of the ball, the house blazed once more. The chandeliers were lit. The orchestra played. 300 guests filled the ballroom in their autumn finery, silks in burgundy and gold and deep forest green, and the air was warm with candlelight and conversation and the sweet complex fragrance of late roses from the garden. Cassia stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the glittering room below. She wore a gown of deep ivory silk that caught the light like water, her dark hair swept up and held with a comb that had belonged to Theron's mother. She was not serving. She was not invisible. She was not wearing the stiff black cotton uniform of erasure. She was the guest of honor. And every person in the room knew it. The orchestra finished their prelude and fell silent. The room stilled. 300 faces turned toward the staircase, expectant, curious, aware that something unprecedented was about to happen. In this house, in this county, the first dance of the Duke's ball was a declaration. It was tradition. It was protocol. The Duke chose his partner, and the choice was a public statement of favor and intention that no one in attendance could fail to read. At the midsummer ball, he had refused the tradition entirely, retreating from the floor in his grief. Tonight would be different. Theron appeared at the foot of the staircase. He was dressed in immaculate black evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from his face, and he looked up at Cassia with an expression that held nothing back. No reserve, no formality, no granite mask. Just a man looking at the woman he loved. He climbed the stairs. He stopped before her and held out his hand. "Miss Lydell," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the silent room. "May I have the first dance?" Cassia took his hand. Her fingers folded into his with the ease of something that had always been meant to fit. She smiled at him, and in that smile was everything: the scullery, the horse, the midnight library, the tears, the silence, the long patient waiting, and the joy of arriving at last. "You may," she said. They descended the staircase together, and the crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. The orchestra lifted their bows. The first notes of a waltz rose into the candlelit air, slow and beautiful and full of a tenderness that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though the house were singing. They danced, the Duke of Harrowden and the scholar's daughter, turning slowly across the gleaming floor in the golden light, while 300 guests watched in silence and understood that they were witnessing not just a dance but a restoration. A woman who had come to this house to serve had been seen and named and chosen. A man who had sealed himself inside his grief had been led back into the world by the quiet courage of a girl who refused to be erased. Outside, beyond the terrace, beyond the lantern-lined paths and the darkened gardens, Reverie stood at the paddock fence in the moonlight, her silver coat luminous, her dark eyes calm and knowing. She watched the lit windows of the great house, and the distant sound of music reached her on the night breeze, and she was still. The ghost of Harrowden Hall was at peace.